Hello and welcome to the Leading Lounge. I'm your host, Dr. Justin Dubose. Here in the Leading Lounge, we talk with today's leaders and unpack lessons learned and being learned from a career of leading and communicating in their field. These conversations are designed to be both informal and informative, and we want to equip you with wisdom and tools to empower you as a leader where you are and where you want to be. Hey everybody, how many of you would say that you struggle to balance life? You struggle to balance work. For many of you, you're pretty heavily involved in ministry. You've got a family. And oh, by the way, you have kind of your own trajectory that you're projecting out towards your own future. You're laying this path, you're driving down this road, and in your mind, it's all coming together. Well, today's guest is Chaplain Colonel Kurt Mueller, and I think today's interview will really be a blessing to you. Kurt has served in the business world in a Fortune 500 company. He served in the active duty Army. He served in the Army Reserves. He served in the National Guard, and he's now pastoring a civilian church. And for the first almost 31 minutes of this interview, Kurt talks about how God just constantly intervened to change his path. And normally I might edit out some of what happens during the course of my interviews, but I left almost all of this one because I think it's important for those of us who are struggling to kind of surrender our will to God's and where he's trying to take us, to hear someone else's story of how it played out in real life and how God orchestrated their path. So up to about the 31 to 32 minute mark of this podcast is Kurt talking about his story. So if you want to skip over some of that and get to more of the leadership-centric questions, you're more than welcome to do that. Wanted to remind you, as I do every time I'm on social media, Communicate to Care, search for us on Facebook. My Twitter handle is at JZDPhD. You can find me there. And almost daily, I'm publishing or sharing resources and articles related to leadership and communication. So follow us, like us, do whatever it is on there, and be encouraged by some of those resources. For today, enjoy this interview with Chaplain Colonel Kurt Mueller. Hey, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Leading Lounge. Got a good friend here today who has a ton of great experience as both a military officer and as a civilian, but hoping to kind of pick your brain a little bit, Kurt, on the military side of stuff and maybe how it influences the civilian stuff you do. So I know a little bit about you, but I'm assuming most folks listening won't know much. So the first question as you start with is, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us about your professional journey that got you to where you are today, wherever that is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Justin. I think the best way to start this off or kind of frame this would just be talking about kind of where I grew up, where I'm from, and how that ended up kind of shaping me, informing me, getting me to the point where I am now. But I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is why sometimes people are like, "Hey, you talk funny." It's like, well, you need somebody up there on the northern part of the United States to defend us from whatever the Canadians might do. So there's that, right? That maple syrup thing, it just might drip south a little bit too quickly. But I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I basically grew up, my dad was a pastor in a conservative Lutheran church. And so I grew up going to church every week during Lent and Advent leading up to Christmas and Easter. While I was growing up too, I went to Lutheran schools. And so I always had some kind of Bible, theology, or doctrine class that I was taking besides all my other subjects. So I grew up in that environment. My wife did too. Her dad was a lay minister. And so we both kind of grew up that same way. We went to high school together, and then we ended up going to college together up in Oshkosh. And while I'm there, I'm getting a business degree. But part of the reason why I went there was, she got into the program she wanted to do too, but I got into this business program that I wanted to take, but they also had a ROTC program the Reserve Officer Training Corps program.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I guess the attraction for me to do ROTC was, hey, you could try it out. It's part-time. You're still in college, but you're also doing this other thing. So you're not exactly like all the other students, but yeah. So my wife and I are going to college together. I'm doing ROTC. I graduate. We end up getting married. And then I go on active duty right away. And the funny thing is, like, this whole time, like, vocationally, I knew God had, I could say this now a little bit easier, but I know God had, like, created me and shaped me and formed me to be in the military and serve in that context in whatever way. But I didn't always look at it like that from the front end. I looked at a lot of it in the beginning as just sort of like serving my country, getting some money for school,
Mm-hmm.
job experience. But the interesting thing was I tried getting into all these different branches that I wanted to, and I ended up not even getting anything I picked because the guy at my school, the senior officer there, he basically was like, hey, I never got to be a finance officer. He was all into the stock market and everything. I was the only business student in ROTC. So all he would do is talk to me about money in the stock market all the time. And then he was an aviator. He was like an Apache pilot or something, right? And I'm like, that would be cool. I want to do that. He's like, no, it just beats you down. You don't want to do that. He's like, I should have gone into finance. That's what I'm recommending you for.
You want to be a finance officer, Kurt?
Right. And so by this point, you're a senior. There's no way you're getting out of anything. And he basically, whatever he's writing is usually what they're doing to people.
Right.
So I end up going to finance school at Fort Jackson. And I'm like, what has happened to me? You don't think, hey, join the military. You see all these movies and you're like, I'm the guy in the back counting the money.
That's right. I'm the bean counter, baby.
Right. So then I'm at Fort Jackson. I'm like, well, okay, I'm going to make the best of this. Maybe I can get a cool assignment somewhere like Hawaii or Germany, maybe even like Colorado or Fort Lewis up by Seattle. They're like, oh, you went to airborne school. I'm like, yeah. They're like, you're going to Fort Bragg. I'm like, yeah, but isn't there another place? They're like, no. There was another guy in my class who was going to Germany, wanted to go to Fort Bragg because he wanted to go to jump school and like jump out of airplanes. And when you come out of this school as a lieutenant, the requirement's basically like you just need somebody who's fogging a mirror who's a second lieutenant with this specialty, right? And so we call the branch manager up. We're like, hey, he's got orders of Germany. I got orders of Fort Bragg. This is like an easy swap. Like we're both saying, okay, sure, you fill your two things you got to fill. And this lady's like, look, it's just better for you two to realize right now, the Army's never going to do what you want it to. It's never going to give you what you asked for. So yeah, I could just switch the two of you, but it's not happening. Don't call back. So then this other guy who's like, hey, I'm going to Fort Lewis. I heard you want to go there too. He actually, I think we had a weekend off where they let us out of Fort Jackson because we were in training technically. He drives up to DC to try to find this lady. It's like, hey, me and Mueller will switch because I want to go to Fort Bragg. And she's like, why does your name keep coming up? Stop having people talk to me. You're going to Fort Bragg. Right?
Well, A for effort, though, man. Taking the drive. That's not a short drive from Jackson up to D.C.
Well, I didn't do it. This other guy wanted to do it because he wanted to switch so bad. And I'm just like, sure, whatever. And then it just made her more upset, which ended up not helping me out 3 years later. So, like, you fast forward to 3 years later, I get done at Fort Jackson. We move up to Fort Bragg. I'm at Fort Bragg trying to be the best financial hero I can be. So, yeah, I'm there for like, I don't know, going on like 2.5 years, 2 years. And this branch manager calls me up again and she's like, hey, I'm moving you here across post to go do this other job. I said, well, I just started working for this general. Like, I just got here. If you move me, they're going to be mad. Like, at least leave me here for a year so I don't have. She's like, no, remember our phone call? Like, you never get what you want. At that point, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of done. So my friend overhears this conversation, who's actually my NCO. He overhears this conversation. He goes, hey, heard the AG guys talking, the HR drones, right? He goes, they're letting officers out early to go join the National Guard because they're short lieutenants. I'm like, okay. So I go home and my wife's like, yes, this Army thing is not good. Let's go back home. So I end up getting a job really quickly with DHL. It's a freight company. It's kind of like FedEx or UPS if you've never heard of them.
Mm-hmm. They're the ones with the yellow
Chicago.
trucks.
Yeah. They're like yellow and red trucks. They're actually the largest freight company in the world. Just market share in the United States is not real big. But so I get a civilian job real quick. I call up the National Guard in Wisconsin. They're like, oh, yeah, we'll take you. Holy smokes. The guy like trips over himself to get all the paperwork done. And then all of it gets pushed through. They let me out of my active duty thing a year early. And I call up the branch manager. I'm going, hey, I just got all my stuff approved. I'm actually out at the end of the summer. So you're going to have to find somebody else to move across post to go to whatever thing she was trying to stick me in, right?
Mm-hmm.
She just blew up on the phone and was like, well, I guess I can't do anything. I'm like, well, that was a great way to try and be empathetic and take care of somebody and listen to them. So
did you give her the line? Hey, the Army you never get what you want in the Army, so good luck.
I probably should have, but I was not that quick witted at that point. Plus, I was a first lieutenant; she was a major, so
yeah, that makes it different.
But yeah, so I had never planned to go like into the National Guard and have a regular job. I thought I would either stay on active duty and do my whole career like that, or I'd get out and like just go get a regular job. So the funny thing about all this is the timing too, right? Like we moved back to like north of Chicago, kind of by Milwaukee. I've got my regular job with DHL. I'm doing a bunch of recruiting for them. And then I'm driving up to Fort McCoy on the weekends to be an officer candidate school instructor. The funny thing is they let me out early because they needed lieutenants. And as soon as I got there, they promoted me to captain. So it's like the whole reason I got out was because they needed lieutenants and all these line units. And then I got there and they're like, holy smokes, somebody who can think on their feet, and nobody wants to do this OCS job. So here you go.
I was going to say the Guard also needed captains, and they probably also needed majors.
Right. Yeah. They needed everybody except for the generals. Those are all full for some reason.
So you get there, they promote you to captain, and then do you go off from there to the OCS instructor gig?
Yeah. And so like put this in context though, this is like at the end of 2000. And so like all the military training I had up to this point and all the people that were like teaching me and mentoring me, they had all grown up, with this Cold War mentality, right? Like the world's going to end. If there isn't a nuclear war, it's going to be a horrible like conflict with Soviets and all the other communists. And so they all had a certain mindset of how to train and get ready to do that. And like there was no gimmies, there was no being nice to anybody. It was all pretty rough. And this is all before like email and the internet too.
Right.
So like just as I was leaving Fort Bragg in 2000, they were just starting to use computers to email people. And the only people that had computers that were emailing each other were like all the colonels and sergeant majors, and they didn't know how to use the stuff. So they all had like some 20-year-old specialists in their office doing the emails for them.
Yeah.
It was almost like a radio operator running messages back and forth. And that little bit of information right there is funny because I saw the exact same thing 20 years later when I was in Afghanistan. And all the Afghan colonels are like, I don't know how to use the computer. So they got some 20-year-old like private who's doing all their emails and like all their computer stuff for them. It's the same kind of thing. So, but no, so like I'm an OCS instructor, and like a year into it, 9/11 happens. But since I'm in such a like, I guess out of the way place, and I'm in a training unit, like the whole start of the thing after 9/11 didn't hit right away. It was kind of like this delayed reaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're still doing our, I'm still at DHL. We're still doing our one weekend a month of this OCS class every year, and 2 years goes by and like nothing, right? It's the beginning of, all the military stuff after 9/11 was pretty small. The special forces guys took care of most of what was going on in Afghanistan. And then all of a sudden we do this crazy left turn and get into Iraq. And that's kind of when any of the personal plans or ideas I had about education or like my future or what I wanted to do kind of went out the window, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one thing too that I started realizing was, so I've got this like corporate job, this Fortune 500 kind of job, and I'm also in the National Guard, and it became difficult to manage both of those.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're trying to have a career like as a civilian and do well, and then also have this military thing on the side in the National Guard or the Reserve, it is hard to do both well.
Yeah, that's a fact.
Like I've noticed too, like even if you try to, there's just something always gives. It's either you don't spend time with your family, or something at work slips through the cracks,
Yep.
or or the guys in the Guard or Reserve side get upset. That's why I think a lot of times you'll see reservists or guardsmen, and they're either really good and they know all their stuff, or they're just not. There's really no middle, because you
Right.
either have the time to like put into it or you don't.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why I was talking to a retention officer at my unit in California, and he said that whole tension is why retention, we have such a problem in the reserves, because guys get into a career over here and a career over here, and the career that's paying them 28 days out of the month, well, they're gonna do that most of the time rather than put in all this time over here.
Right. Well, and just the way that they've structured everything too is to stay in the Guard or Reserve and get promoted, because they won't let people just stay in the position they're in. You either got to get promoted and move up, or you get like booted at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so just even to do all the educational stuff, you got to get into a class and then have the time to do it, right? And you can't always get into a class. You need to get promoted or, learn about what you're supposed to actually be doing. And so I think, the other thing too is, some command and staff college guy did a study like 10 years ago and was like, hey, all these mandatory training requirements, you literally can't do them in a whole year.
Mm-hmm.
And then, oh, by the way, the Guard and Reserve, like their layer of stuff that they got to do, even though it's not as extensive, they literally don't have enough training time with all their weekends and 2 weeks to do all this stuff. So why is everybody saying they're completing all their training? Like, why is everyone lying?
Yeah, because you
Right?
have to lie in order to just to check the boxes you have to check.
Right. So they changed some of that and they backed off a little bit, but that just like goes to show you right there. There's literally not enough time to do everything. So yeah, the big challenge is like managing your time. So,
Yep.
so it got to the point where I could kind of juggle it, and I would just manage my own schedule. And the week before a drill weekend, I would just work longer Monday through Thursday. 'Cause on Friday before a drill weekend, everybody starts calling you and asking for stuff or telling you what's happening. And you kind of start getting sucked into that and you lose focus of what's going on at work. So,
Mm-hmm.
so my company was very supportive of all that stuff on the front end, because I worked for a retired lieutenant colonel. But what happened after about 2 years, I went from the Guard to the Army Reserve and took command of this garrison support unit. And literally, like, I think that was in September. And then in January, we got mobilized because the whole thing in Iraq was starting. So they were all kind of, okay, yay, we support you. This is great. I was gone for a year and a half, and when I came back, they were like, "Well, we're glad that's over, right? Hope that doesn't happen again." So then, fast forward a year later, the war's not just over; it's like getting bigger by the day,
Yeah,
right?
it's just cranking up.
So I got called up for all of 2003, and then 2004, I went back to my job, and then I went to a different reserve unit that was closer to my house, so I wouldn't have to drive. And all they were doing was certifying post mobilization training for the units that were getting called up. So I get there, and as soon as I get there, they're like, "We're running out of people. We're not going to have you do the thing you were going to do. We're gonna make you the company commander for the headquarters." So like the whole time I was a captain, except for when I was an OCS instructor, I was a company commander because they couldn't find anybody else to do it because nobody wanted to be in charge of anything
Mm-hmm.
because you're literally getting phone calls all day, every day at your regular job,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
So I get there and I'm like, "Oh, great." I'm like, "Well, at least I'm not going to get called up again because this unit is no, like a year later, I get called up again
Mm.
because they're running out of people because the surge in Iraq is starting to take off, right?"
Mm-hmm.
And so after about a year of being there, I'm like, I can't keep doing this. My boss started calling me. He was livid. He was pissed.
This is your civilian boss?
Yeah, my
Yeah.
civilian boss was like, he was like pissed to no end. It's like, "What are you doing to us? You're letting the team down. This is horrible." I said, "You just told me this was the greatest thing ever last year." It's like, "Well, not anymore, right?"
Right.
And so, I mean, to put this in context too, the job I had, I was a recruiter for like the whole middle of the United States. So when I wasn't at my job, it wasn't just a couple people noticing. It was like all these vice presidents and district
Mm-hmm.
managers who needed stuff.
Right.
So, so he's like, "All right, fine, do your year. And then after that, you should probably think about getting out, not doing that anymore." It's like, if you want to stay here and like keep progressing with the company and everything. And
Yep.
I'm like, "Isn't that literally illegal? Like, you shouldn't even be saying that." He's like, "Yeah, but this is the reality of it. I'm trying to like help you figure stuff out." And I'm like, "I don't think you're helping me figure stuff out. I think you're trying to make sure that you're comfortable and don't have to deal with any of this."
Right.
So yeah, after about a year of getting called up there and working at this headquarters, my orders are about to end. And the active duty Army calls me and is like, "Hey, we're running out of people. You want to come back on active duty?" And I'm like, "Well, no, because every time I tried to get like a good assignment, like you guys told me no. And I don't think my wife wants to do that either. So no."
And you're still a finance MOS, right? Or are
I
you
was, but
AG?
then I had also taken the class to become like an HR officer.
Okay.
So at this point, I'm finance, but then I can also do like the HR thing,
Okay.
which is what the active Army called me about. They're like, "We need HR guys. We see you finish this. You want to come back and play?" And I'm like, "No, you're not going to send me anywhere cool." They're like, "Well, yeah, we can send you to Fort Bragg." I'm like, "Holy crap, it's happening again." I'm like, "I am not going to Fort Bragg. No."
I've seen this movie before.
So then I go home and I tell my wife, Gina, and she's like, "Well, you keep getting called up. Maybe just be better if we weren't getting jerked around all the time." She's like, "Okay, fine. Tell him you'll do it, but only if you can go to Hawaii, because that's where I want to go." I said, "Okay, yeah, Hawaii's on the list. I wouldn't mind going there." So I call the guy back, and he's like, this was the captain's assignment officer. He goes, "No way, man. You're never going to Hawaii. I got too many requirements at Fort Bragg. You're parachute qualified. Your physical's all good." He's like, "Hawaii's never happening." So I'm like, "All right." So what I didn't know in the background was the company command job I had was actually for a major. So the G1, the HR guys at our headquarters put me in for a vacancy promotion. And so like all of a sudden I get this email like, "Hey, you're getting promoted to major." So this guy calls me back a third time like, "Hey, look, I can promise you Hawaii after you go to the 82nd and do this deployment and come back. I'll put it in writing too." I said, "Well, I just got picked up for major." And he's like, "Oh, crap. Now I need to talk to this person." So I talked to this major. She's like, oh, yeah, Captain so-and-so handed me your file. I'm looking at it. She's like, what do you want to do? I said, well, I've gotten mobilized twice now. It's probably going to happen a third time with the way things are going, or they're not going to release me. So I started thinking about it when he called me, and I went, maybe I should just go back on active duty. That'd probably be the better thing to do at this point. And I kind of know what's happening day to day and not like, what am I going to go back to my job and have them fire me or right?
Right.
So she goes, well, what do you want to do? I said, literally, I'll go to any kind of unit. I said, but my wife said she won't sign up to do this again unless we can go to Hawaii. She's like, oh, no problem. I can send you there right away.
Wow.
Right? So I'm like, okay. So right as she gives me orders of Hawaii, some reserve unit calls me up and says, hey, do you want a tour in Hawaii too? And I'm like, I guess I'm supposed to go to Hawaii now. So I tell my boss, hey, my orders are ending, but the regular Army just snatched me up. So I'm going to go on a leave of absence, like a USERRA leave of absence, not just a, contingency operation sort of thing. And you got 5 years to be gone from that, right?
Right.
So I end up going out to Hawaii. I get in this unit. All we're doing is training to get deployed. Do like a year of train up, get deployed. And in the background this whole time, I keep having people tell me, you're actually really nice to all these soldiers. Like when I was an OCS instructor, they're like, you're really nice to all these soldiers. You're supposed to be a little meaner when they're in training, right? And then when I was a company commander, my first sergeants were like, you don't have to spend this much time trying to talk to people and help them out. And every time people would say stuff like that, they're like, you should just be a chaplain at this point. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do that. My dad was a pastor. I don't want to be a pastor. Not doing that. No way. So after I get out to Hawaii, like it hits me like a 2x4 across the face. God's sort of like, hey, I've been trying to tell you, you need to start going to seminary to be a pastor, right? So okay. So I started taking some classes online. Then I started flying to school I was going to. I was going to Regent University, and I had to go there and take classes like 2 weeks at a time.
So you're flying from Hawaii to Virginia Beach?
Yeah. And the funny thing is, like, the guys I'm working for, we're getting ready to do a deployment. And they're like, okay, take as much time as you need. They kept giving me like permissive TDY, take educational classes. They just kept letting me go. It was kind of like God was sort of making them do all this stuff on my behalf, I guess. And kind of make a long story short, like I end up getting deployed. I help out at all these chapels. I meet a guy there who was part of the denomination I'm in now. And God just sort of lined up all these people to help me get through seminary and all my ordination training. And at the end of all this, I end up in Alaska because there's an airborne unit up there they sent me to. I get deployed to Afghanistan again. So like from 2006 to 2013, I was on active duty as a line officer in all these airborne units. And I get to the end of my deployment in Afghanistan because I was a combat advisor. And I'm done with seminary. I'm an ordained pastor at this point. My wife and I have been serving as missionaries with crew for about, 6 or 7 months. And I'm just like, yeah, I think I'm supposed to leave active duty, which did not make any sense because I was like a major who was promotable, waiting for the command list to come out. I think at that point it's like 16 years in. Like nobody, you don't just leave active duty. And
Right,
like,
yeah.
So everyone's like, what are you doing? I said, I'm resigning and I'm going to be a chaplain in the National Guard. And people are like, you've lost your mind.
Yeah. All you got to do is sit on your hands for 4 years and you're free and clear.
I'm like, yeah, but it was pretty clear to me when I was in Afghanistan, a lot of stuff that was happening. Like all these advisors were getting shot and ambushed. And I was in the middle of all that. I wasn't afraid of it. But I just started seeing all these people that had all these really bad mental health, marriage, family problems. and they're all trying to like self-medicate or get counseling, and nobody was like pointing them to who God is and how he can take care of them and heal them and kind of lead them through that and restore them. And so I started seeing all that, and I'm like, I think probably would be better if I was doing this as a chaplain. Yeah, so at this point we're in Alaska. We had left Hawaii, but like I called the National Guard up there, and they're like, hey, we've basically lost everybody. There's like 2 chaplains left for the whole state for the National Guard. Like, we looked at your file, like the commander here basically said, if you want to be the state chaplain, we'll just hold the position for you till you get here. And I'm like, oh, is this full time? They're like, no, 1 weekend a month. That's it. Like, okay. At this point, I'm a major who's almost a lieutenant colonel, and they're not really supposed to let you switch branches at this point. So I end up moving to Hawaii. We start moving back to Hawaii, I should say. And I just started all my training to become a chaplain. I spent like a year at the chaplain school doing all the chaplain classes. But I think the thing you asked me about was became a church pastor last year, right?
Yeah. So hold on, just to make sure. So you had like basically a whole military career, what most people would do for a career behind you before you ever took your first civilian pastorate, right?
Oh yeah. So I mean, like if you think about it, I mean, I've been in the military. I've been in like corporate America. The problem I see with a lot of pastors now, especially, is the ones who just went straight to school and like tried to go into church planning or something. It's not that they're bad, or it's not that God didn't like call them to do that. They have kind of this different view or this disconnect between, I think, what it's like for the people in the pews trying to go to a job every day,
right,
versus like what they're doing during the week.
Right. Because their experience is school, like Bible college, maybe seminary, straight into a church setting.
But yeah, so like part of the issue I have is like I became a pastor and I thought, hey, everybody is like on the same team. We're all peers. And I just noticed there's not always a lot of cooperation or collegiality between pastors at different churches.
Right.
And so I think part of that is just like what you're talking about, right? Get people from different backgrounds and denominations, and they had all these different views on what to do and how to do things. And yeah, that's part that's probably been difficult, has been just trying to get along with and work with other ministry leaders, because some of them, I just wonder, like, do they even realize what's happening to people out there at their jobs on a regular basis?
Are you talking about ministry leaders as in other pastors, not folks in your church?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can only ask volunteers to do so much. You can only put so much of a burden on people from the pulpit every week without recognizing how hard it is just to be a Christian trying to go to your job and make a living every day now. Right?
And not only make a living, but make a living and be a good husband, be a good father, you know, be a decent neighbor, like in your neighborhood, like all those things. Yeah. If you just pile on volunteer stuff at church, you end up making them, you take away
from those people out.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So when you had all this military background and you go to be a pastor of a local church, did you find that like all the military officer stuff was, and I'm sure maybe it's both ways, some helpful, some not so helpful in the local church, but like one of the things I struggle with transitioning from is I'll go off 3 weeks in the field and I'll come back and I'm like Major Dubose, you know, and I have to like kind of, okay, that's right, this is a different setting and whatever. So have you found, but I've also found conversely, there's certain things about the military that the church really, really needs. The leadership.
So on the one hand, you've got like, you have to sort of like take your rank or the stuff you've done and kind of put it to the side, just leave it in the background. Because you've got a wide variety of people that are attending the church usually. Like some of them went to college, some of them didn't. Some of them have had longstanding careers or other military service. And so everybody's different. So you have to all approach them differently. But the one thing that I think helps being in the military and then going to a church is a lot of times the administrative side of stuff either gets ignored or neglected.
Mm-hmm.
I think you get used to doing that as a chaplain. You're like, well, I got to do a certain amount of paperwork. I have to make sure contracts and things are done right.
Yeah.
Got to make sure, the money's being handled properly, not by me, but by somebody else who knows how to do that. And so I think a lot of times people that are gifted in preaching and teaching and just kind of getting people together to, do things for the community, that doesn't always translate into being organized and
Right.
making sure that all the stuff that you can get in trouble with administratively is taken care of,
Yeah. Yeah, because it's inherently it's an organization, and so there's a pretty heavy admin load even in a small church that you can really whatever negatively affect all the pastoral stuff you do if the admin isn't getting done. So let me ask you this question because one of the focuses of the podcast is on communicating. So I love to ask everybody like a time when you failed at communicating, whether it's in a military setting or in a civilian setting. So can you recall like a specific time and maybe what you learned from it and did it change like now that you're a pastor or now that you're in these bigger areas of responsibility as a chaplain, did it change anything about the way you communicate with folks?
I got two examples I guess I could think of. Like the one is when I was up in Alaska, I was talking to all these different people to get our brigade manned and filled up with enough people so we could deploy. And so I had to talk to like people from Human Resources Command, the Pentagon, these other places they were coming from, because you couldn't just randomly PCS or move to Alaska. Like it was kind of complicated
Mm-hmm.
because of geography and the way the Army kind of assigned people there. And so like there was a lot of moving parts to that. So you got all these people like in the lower 48 who need to know what's happening, but then you also have the people at the installation locally who are handling a lot of the incoming personnel and assignments. And then you got the commander I was working for who wanted what he wanted and he didn't care about the rest of them.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to talk to each of them individually and mitigate what one was trying to do to each other and try to get the boss what he wanted, the people that he wanted. But I didn't have them all talk to each other together at least once a week. And so what ended up happening was the boss didn't get what he wanted, even though I would explain it to him. He'd be mad at the person down the street or down in Human Resources Command who told us no. And even by the time I explained to him why we couldn't get what he asked for, like he just couldn't handle that. He was like exploding mad. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, ooh, I probably should have set up like a conference call once a week and had him do those conversations that I had already done in the background and had them try to tell him no instead of me being like the messenger, the
Right.
intermediary. Because all it kept happening was I just kept getting blown up.
Mm-hmm.
And then like we'd have an officer show up and he'd be like, we don't want him. And then he's there. If the unit doesn't want him, the installation's got to do something with him, but there's nowhere else for him to go because it's Alaska. So like we had this lieutenant show up that they didn't want because he hadn't been to Ranger school. And I'm like, well, there's no requirement for him to be a Ranger school graduate. So we don't want him. And when you talk to the guy though, he was a lieutenant who had already been to Iraq twice,
Mm.
right? He'd already been to like jump master school. The reason he didn't go to Ranger school was his wife had some kind of health problem and he couldn't leave her alone for more than a couple weeks.
Oh man.
And so like he was trying to balance that and they just didn't care. They thought he was a piece of garbage. So eventually they realized that was a mistake, but it was that kind of stuff where I think if I would have had him talking to the people he needed to instead of me trying to do all the communicating in between all these different organizations, probably would
Mm-hmm.
have turned out better. It's the same thing with the church though, too, right? Like if we're having a Bible study or an event or something, and I only tell like two of the elders and maybe the deaconess who's getting stuff ready individually what's happening, but I don't have them all talk about it together. People do overlapping work,
Right.
right? Or they send out the same kind of information to the same group of people, and then it just causes confusion. So I think when you're in a leadership position and the higher up you go or the more people that you have to like share the information and include people in a discussion until you get to a decision point or an event that you're planning, right?
Yeah.
We're considering how to restart the church here. And so intuitively, I kind of know what we need to do and some of the things we need to look at. And I'm like, if I just do that on my own and tell everybody,
Right.
it's not gonna help. So I put this vision team together with some of the elders and the other members. And so we're gonna go over this once a month, like for a couple hours every month. We're gonna look at this together and have a discussion. So by the time we get to the end of it, everybody's seen and heard everything, and we've all come to the same sort of conclusion, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So we spent time doing that, and it took about a year, and now we're getting ready to kind of move forward with some of the decisions and ideas that came up from that.
Yeah.
And I think people are more open to it, and they're going to support it more because it wasn't just me telling them what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Kurt didn't go up to the mountaintop and hear directly from the Lord and come down and tell all the people, this is what we're going to do, you know?
So what's funny is they admitted to me over the course of a year, it would be a different person every month. Well, yeah, the last two pastors said we should do that, but we just said no.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally, like more than half the stuff that came up. Well, yeah, the last guy said he wanted to do that too. And I said, at this point, you got to wonder, that's probably God telling you guys to do this stuff. And you're just like, no, we're not doing it.
Right.
If
Yeah.
I'm the third or fourth guy.
But I had what you're talking about with communication. I had that same realization here in my church where I'm at, which is I realized at some point I'm the choke point because just I don't know, the way things have always been is we go through the pastor, we go through this one guy, and it's like, wait, let me not be the choke point. Let's open this valve up, and then all of a sudden, it's everyone's idea. They own it together. It's not just my thing or me as the sole communication point between this person and that group or
Sure.
whatever. So, no, very practical stuff. So let me finish with this question. I like to ask people if the present nearing retirement Kurt Mueller could meet with a young, fresh Lieutenant Mueller, what advice about leadership would you give yourself?
I mean, really, it's kind of like, because I thought about this before we talked too, and it's kind of one of those sort of cliche things, right? I mean, the Army calls it selfless service. If you think about, you look at the Gospels and what Jesus did, like he washed his disciples' feet. Really, you need to know the people that are working for you and with you, and you need to know like what makes them tick and how you can help take care of them so that they can focus on whatever task or assignment or ministry that they're involved in.
Hmm.
I think when you start out, a lot of times you're just like, hey, I want to get the job done and go through a checklist and make things happen. You kind of lose sight of that. But really, if you're a good leader and you're doing your job the right way, you should be able to remove yourself from that position, and everybody should be able to keep doing everything without you being there.
Yep.
A lot of people don't want to do that because then they're like, oh, I've worked myself out of a job, or they don't need me. And it's like, well, that's actually the point you want to get to, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You want to work yourself out of a job.
I mean, or conversely, if you don't, you want to be, mentoring and teaching and raising up people who can go out and do things. And so you got to be willing to release them.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't know any of that if you don't know them or you're not trying to take care of them, and you're not kind of in this sort of, fight together. So I think that's the one thing you get from the military is everybody puts aside stuff and tries to focus on the mission and get stuff done. I think that's the one thing that the church would benefit from is kind of looking at the mission of sharing the gospel with that sort of a mindset. I think people would put aside a lot of the other things they get upset or disappointed with.
Right. So. Yeah. I read this book. In fact, I'm using it for a college class I'm teaching at Toccoa, but I think it's called It's Good to Great, Jim Collins, but he's talking about the difference. He compares all these like corporate leaders and shows how the guys who.
That's a good book.
Yeah. Have you read that one? Yeah. It's really good. So he shows these guys who basically built a whole company on themselves. that when they stepped out, the thing just absolutely tanked, and then it's not even existent anymore, as opposed to the guys who invested in mentoring and whatever, and that even after they left their position or they died, even the company just kept, just kept growing and kept killing it because it
So the
wasn't about them.
military is like built to do that intentionally, like replace people, right? And I think the danger with church ministry now in some of these churches is they are personality driven,
Hmm.
right? And so when the one guy leaves, everything sort of implodes or the giving stops or whatever. And I can't
Right,
even believe how many places you go to now, and like the pastor will have his own ministry and it's all about him and his own name
right.
or his books that he's selling or whatever. And I'm kind of like, okay, I guess you're getting a lot of attention and there's a lot of activity, but does that translate into people coming to know who Christ is and being discipled? I don't think those two things are the same most of the time.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah, sort of like our mutual friend, I think the guy that even connected is Scott Bordered. He sent me a text one time. It was a picture of this billboard he saw in like the Metroplex in Dallas. And it was
yeah.
this pastor's face on this billboard. And the only thing it said was like, do you want to see God or something like that? And so Scott takes a picture of this thing. He sent it to me and he was like, I have seen the face of God. But it led to this whole conversation about the whole thing being built on one guy and his face and his personality and his gift set and everything else. But hey, let me ask you one other question before
Okay.
we sign off. But so you got all these deployments under your belt.
Yeah.
What's one story you can share? I found
Okay.
them.
So my last deployment was like 10 years ago. I was in Afghanistan. I was a combat advisor. I was living in this compound over by Jalalabad with the Afghans, right? So I get there and I notice I have just finished seminary. I'm a, I'm an ordained pastor. I'm licensed. I'm doing stuff with Campus Crusade. But I get to this forward operating base, right? And I'm like, I notice, hey, this room, this building looks like it used to be a chapel. And then I find out, oh yeah, there was a brigade headquarters here for a little bit, and then they left and the Afghans took it over. But we're here now, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, it definitely used to be a chapel. So the door was kind of cracked open, so I may have liberated the lock and gone inside of it. And I go inside and I start looking around. I'm like, definitely was a chapel. I could tell by the way it's set up and laid out. I go into the closet, just kind of looking around, and there was all these altar linens, communion trays, crosses, just dumped in a pile in the corner.
Wow.
So I go to the FOB mayor and I'm like, hey, what's up with that building? They're like, yeah, the MWR guys are going to give us some more video games and stuff to put in there. And I said, we've already got 2 buildings full of that, and there's only like 100 of us here. Like, we can't even fill that whole space up. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
He's like, well, yeah, that's what they're planning on doing. And I said, okay, no problem. This is like the first week I'm there. So then I started asking around. I'm like, hey, we don't have a chapel. There's no chaplain. Is anybody doing a Bible study? They're like, well, somebody was, but he left. And I said, okay, I'll do one. So I put the word out. I'm like, hey, Bible study next week at the chapel. And everyone's like, huh? So all these people show up. Then I'm like, I show them around. I'm like, hey, this used to be the chapel. We're going to do Bible study in here. They're like, great. I said, but we should make this a chapel again, right? This sergeant's like, yeah, exactly. I said, but they're about to turn this into a rec hall, even though we already got 2 of those. I said, I think we should just get a sign for it, get the keys for it, and take it over. And they're like, yeah, let's do it. So this staff sergeant goes and has a bunch of signs made, chapel, right? He puts them, screws them up on the building. I go to the mayor's office and I go, hey, there's still a lock on the one door. Where are the keys? And the guy's like, well, they're right there. And I'm like, okay, thanks. He's like, what are you doing? I'm like, that's the chapel now. I'm taking the keys. He's like, you can't do that. I'm like, what are you going to do? deploy me to a crappy place in Afghanistan where I might get killed, right? So we start doing all these Bible studies. It gets so big because I have all these third country nationals and some of the Afghans coming to the services
Wow.
that I'm like, okay, I'll ask for an actual chaplain to come. So I call up the Bagram and I'm like, hey, we got this thing open. There's like 50 to 70 people a week. Can you send a chaplain here once a month? Oh, the general I work for is a Catholic and he hasn't been able to go to mass. Can you send a priest once a month to do mass for him too? There's about 10 other people that said they were Catholic. And they're like, who are you? Major Mueller. They're like, what are you doing? You can't be doing that. I said, okay, we'll send a chaplain over here then. Well, where are you? No, that's too dangerous. We're not sending anybody. I'm like, okay, I'm going to keep doing this thing then. But you can't do that. We're telling you to stop. I'm like, no, I'm not going to stop. You can't make me. You can come down here and support us, right? Or I'm going to keep doing this because you're not supporting us. And so I start getting all these horrible phone calls and hate emails from them like, stop having Bible studies. You can't call that a chapel. That shouldn't be open. So the whole time I'm there like 9 months. And this thing, I got to the point where it was like almost everybody who was deployed there, plus all these people from other countries who were supporting us doing all this logistics stuff, right? So it's like almost 100 people. So
Oh.
I didn't go on my block leave until the end, or my R&R, I should say, till the very end of my deployment. So I was like going to go away for 2 weeks, come back for 2 weeks, and then we were leaving. So I hand off the stuff to two of the NCOs there and say, hey, here are the keys. We set up an office for the chaplain, for a chaplain assistant, put the altar and everything back together. We got TVs and put all the audio visual stuff up, right? Like this was like,
Man,
place
this is
is set.
legit.
So I go on R&R and the whole time I'm like, hey God, if you don't send somebody, when I leave, that whole thing's going to like spiral because the NCOs are just going to get run over, right? I can kind of get away with it as a major, but so I come back from R&R and I'm in my PTs. This is important because my name tag's not on, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm in my PTs and like I get back, I'm walking around, check in at my office, go see the other guys are helping me with the Bible study, go over to the chapel to see if everything's good to go. And I go to the chapel and it's open and there's lights on. And I look and there's a specialist in the chaplain's assistant office. And then as I look around the corner, there's a captain in the chaplain's office. And I'm like, oh, hey, chaplain, what's up? He goes, who are you? I said, oh, I just got back from R&R. I'm wondering when the Bible study in the next service is. He goes, yeah, some freaking Major Mueller, some guy. He started all this and opened this. So they send me here from the other assignment I was at. He goes, this place is a crap hole. I'm like, oh, good. So you're going to be here full time now? He's like, yeah. There were so many complaints. And I guess the Afghans want to do some like mill-to-mill engagements with their imams. So I'm here now. Great. That's awesome. I'm like, Sergeant so-and-so can give you the keys. This guy knows where all the books and things are. And then this lady, like, she can help you with getting the word out and everything. And like, that's great. I'll see you in a couple days for Bible study. He's like, yeah, if you see that guy, let him know I want to talk to him. I'm supposed to tell him to stop pretending to be a chaplain over here. So I didn't go to anything the next week or two I was there, and I just left. Yeah, I had an illegal chapel according to the chaplain corps, and I was doing services and stuff we weren't supposed to be doing.
But you created a whole spot for this fresh 03 chaplain to come, and
I kind of felt bad for him because he was like had some sweet getup he was supposed to be doing in Bagram. They just basically yanked him out of that and were like, here, take care of this problem.
Oh man, that's so good. That's one of the many reasons you and I get along so well. Those people are like, you can't do that. And you're like, okay, bye.
Right? It's one of the only pictures I have from that deployment is me standing in front of that thing with the chapel sign behind me with like a thumbs up.
Nice. Nice. You have to send that to me. I'll make that. I take all these interviews and put like one picture over the audio. It's like the way I put them on YouTube. So if you'll send me
Okay.
that picture, I'll put it on the audio. That'll be like the
All
picture that
right.
goes with this podcast. But
I'll try
anyway,
to go
hey man, I
find it.
appreciate your time and appreciate you sharing some stuff with us and praying for you with your church and hope all goes well. Enjoyed being able to chat with you. So thanks, man.
All right. Well, you take care. Have fun down there in Texas.
Yeah, I shall. Thank you guys for listening to Leading Lounge, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us today. The Leading Lounge is brought to you by Communicate to Care, where we are building better leaders by building better people. For more information, visit us online at www.communicatecare.com. This is your host, Dr. Justin Dubose, and we'll see you next time, right here in the Leading Lounge.